We could talk a bit about where we are, first of all, and introduce the vast audience.
Yes, the New Rochelle house. Well, this is Thomas Paine's cottage in New Rochelle, which is now a monument of some sort. I'm not really quite sure about that. But in any case, it was the cottage on the farm that was given to Paine by the American government in recognition of his services after the Revolution. And he lived here for a time. Did he live here? I'm not even quite sure myself whether he lived here after he returned to the United States. And the stories that I remember about it were simply that Paine was so disliked by his neighbors because he was thought to be a rather dangerous, free-thinking sort. The little kids used to throw stones at him and rocks at him, and basically he hung around this house wishing he were back with his friends in New York City, which is true about a lot of people who are forced to go to the suburbs from New York, in my experience. But in any case, that's this house. And he lived here for a time, and it was a token by the American government to Paine, concrete token, at a time when Paine himself was, his fortunes, his reputation had certainly declined at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century.
Do you think he got his due from the United States?
Did he get his due? Well, he was very proud of it, from what I remember. I mean, he was very pleased that the government had done so, had seen fit to give him some sort of, not a pension, but some sort of recognition for his services. After all, he spent much of the Revolution writing all these things and, trying to get paid. He was living by his pen, and he didn't have a lot of money. He had no other way to support himself. So he was always having to hunker after pensions of various kinds or find some way for the government to support him.
Don't look at Richard. You keep your eye on me,
okay,
or you'll look like Nixon.
Oh, okay. Well, I wouldn't want us to do that.
It was from the government of New York.
Oh, okay.
I just think in terms of his memory, some general statement about that. We know Washington's on the money, Jefferson's on the money.
Sure. And where is Paine? Yeah, Paine is in New Rochelle. It's true. Well, Paine's legacy is a very interesting question. I think to talk about it, we ought to talk about it not just in terms of the United States, but in terms of all of the countries that he had a hand in affecting. France, the United States, and Great Britain. And you see that his legacy is really very different in those three countries. Taking them in some kind of order. In Britain, probably, his reputation, his standing, his legacy has been the strongest, the most obvious. In a land where the revolution of the 18th century never broke out, Paine was very much remembered by the labor movement, subsequent working-class radical groups, and his memory ends up in the songs and festivities of the Labor Party, even unto this day. Very strong association between Thomas Paine and the English labor movement that lasted all through the 19th century, from Chartism right up to the early socialist movements in the 19th century and on into the 20th century. So Paine is thought very much as a forerunner of the English labor movement, and there the formal connection is the strongest. In France, of the three, his memory until very, very recently has been the weakest. People haven't really remembered much about Thomas Paine. It's curious as to why that would be so, because after all, the revolution had no greater defender than Thomas Paine. And there are two reasons, I think. One of them just has to do with the French inability to recognize anybody who wasn't French, a certain French xenophobia, that was their revolution after all, and who was this American, an Anglo-American, to tell them what to do or to be part of the revolution. But something more profound, I think, and that is that the revolution's history got written by basically celebrators of the Jacobin tradition, the Robespierreists and the Jacobins of one kind or another. One generation of them after another wrote the history of the revolution. That was what the revolution became associated with. On one side or the other, there were the pro-Jacobins who tended to be the people who wrote the history books for a number of reasons, which I won't go into. And then the anti-revolutionary types who were always fastening on the Reign of Terror as the great symbol, the great emblem of the French Revolution. Well, Paine was not a Jacobin. Paine was on the other side of the revolution, if you will. He was for the revolution, but he was a Girondin. That faction...
Explain this to American audiences.
in the French Revolution, the revolutionaries themselves factionalized, as in all great revolutions. And the supporters of Robespierre, the people who eventually promulgated the Reign of Terror, were known as the Jacobins, and they were in some ways the most ultraist, the most in favor of a reign of terror, of a public directory, of a kind of revolutionary dictatorship to take the revolution forward. The Girondins were moderates, and Paine, when he came to Paris, for reasons in part accidental, but also, whoops.
We'll cut to the Crisis Cafe. I see the link.
I was going to say, right, Sean Wilentz, The Hidden Story. Right? So what do I do with it? I never put on makeup before in my life.
You go pat.
You do a pat, huh?
Pat the bunny.
Pat the bunny.
Okay, where were we?
We were talking about Jacobins and Girondins. So that Thomas Paine was a Girondin and a supporter of the moderate faction of the revolution.
Which is curious. I mean,
oh no, it's not curious in that, especially on the issue of the killing of the king. When the time came to debate in the French convention what would become of this king, Paine believed very, very strongly that the king ought not to be executed. And he made a very powerful speech, in fact, at the convention for not taking the life of a man, that an institution was being overthrown, that the man's life need not be taken. In some ways, his Quaker principles showed up, his old Quaker principles showed up in that speech. At any rate, he found himself on the outs. He found himself on the outs with the Jacobins and paid for it by spending a fairly long time in a Jacobin prison as a result, which connects with his legacy in France. The fact is that because he doesn't fit comfortably into the Jacobin version of the revolution, either for or against, he's not part of the revolution in that way. It's only been very recently, in fact, that Paine has been revived in France, in part because of the work of a particular professor in France, but also I think because the French history has been undergoing a process of de-Jacobinization, or removing the Jacobins as the centerpiece for understanding French history.
what about Paine here?
Pull your time. Oh, just center a little bit. Good, thank you.
So we're talking about reputation here
And his reputation here.
in the United States.
Here it's been much more complicated. Paine is remembered as a great patriot, sort of generic patriot. But his memory doesn't burn with the luster of a George Washington or a Thomas Jefferson or any of the other great heroes we think about as being on our money. In part it's because he never held public office, so that those people who became presidents or held some sort of public trust naturally seem to have more importance attached to their lives. But it's more complicated than that as well. After Paine returned, as we know, returned to the United States, he was reviled, very widely reviled, for his religious views, his deistical religious views. As a result, he died really a forgotten man. It's a very poignant, very sad scene of his death in 1809 in New York, where buried near here at first, but he died in New York City, and there was a tiny group of friends and the gravedigger and the gravedigger's helpers at his grave, and really he was forgotten. His memory then picked up 10 years later. In 1825, there was a meeting held at a place called Harmony Hall in New York City. A group of freethinkers, a group of deists, who remembered Paine not only for his deism and his free thought, but also for his contributions to the revolution, to the great revolutions of the end of the 18th century. And they held the first Thomas Paine birthday dinner on January 29th, 1825. It was a mixed group of people, some of them emigres from Britain, some of them Native American radicals of one kind or another, who just got together. I think there was 40 of them at that first meeting in 1825 to commemorate Paine's existence, to commemorate his birthday. Well, the next year they had another celebration, and the next year they had another celebration. And by the middle of the 1830s, there were Thomas Paine birthday celebrations being held in major cities all across the northern United States, as far west as Cincinnati, Ohio, all the way up into New England. And there were local Tom Paine societies of one kind or another. And many of these people actually got involved as well in the very early labor movement in the major cities. And there was always a very close connection between appreciation of Paine and a sentiment or support for American labor movement's rights. Not unlike what occurred in Britain. So that was really the first
So could you describe these meetings? What do they do? What do they...
Well, at these meetings, they were really quite extraordinary. They would all to get together for dinner. They'd have a large banquet room. But they'd all stand up and say toasts in the manner of the day to commemorate not simply Tom Paine, and they would have lots to say about Tom Paine, about why he was so great, but also all the other heroes, the great heroes that they thought were very much in the Paineite tradition. Everybody from Shakespeare to Byron. There was one guy, I remember reading one of these toasts, the guy must have had lungs made out of leather. He went on, he mentioned 40 people that were all in the Paineite tradition, from the English peasant revolutionary rebel Wat Tyler from the 14th century, all the way through to Toussaint Louverture in Haiti. All the great rebels, all the great standers up against tyranny, opponents of tyranny, they were the Paineites as far as this guy was concerned. So they would have these toasts, and it was a chance for them to gather together to express their similarities, their similar point of view, at a time when their views were quite clearly in the minority in America. But it gave them a sense of their own strength, and I think actually to the amazement of some of them, as the dinners began to grow and as they began to spread, they realized that there were actually a lot more of people out there who were Paineites than they might at first have imagined.
I think the image of him being dug up for me was so powerful. The fact that he seemed to die and then...
Poor Paine, poor Paine. You mean where are his bones? Which is part of it as well. I mean, no one even knows where the man has no burial place, which in some ways is fitting. I mean, he is a sort of international figure. He's kind of disappeared. We don't exactly know where he is, so maybe he's everywhere. But Paine's legacy after that did not fare so well. He was always kind of an underground figure, you see, in America. I mean, people would read him with a certain amount of care and caution. You didn't say you were a Painite in polite society. You would be considered too rebellious. That was a true sign of religious unorthodoxy, or being outside the grain, or running against the grain, rather. So after the 1840s, there's a bit of Paineism going on, but really not very much until the 1870s and 1880s. Now, there was a strand of opinion that had been related to these freethinkers, of which maybe the best representative is Walt Whitman, the old Free Soil Democrats, who in the 1840s and 50s, many of whom ended up supporting the Republican Party in the war against slavery, or moved into the Republican Party in the 1850s. Paine to them remained a hero, and you can see that actually in the monument that's built out here in New Rochelle, which was designed by a man named John Frazee, who was an old member of the New York Workingmen's Party. Well, Whitman was a young editor in New York at the end of the 1830s, beginning of the 1840s, and he hung around with these people. He was very much a part of this world of Hicksite Quakers and all sorts of religious schismatics and freethinkers, and he identified with them. And he was a great admirer of Thomas Paine's. In fact, in the 1870s, he gave a speech at a commemoration of Paine's birthday in Philadelphia, in which he talked about reverentially throwing his pebble upon Thomas Paine's cairn, which is a fancy way of saying that even though in polite society he was considered a rebel, he, Walt Whitman, the great American poet, was showing his respect for Paine's memory. What one finds...
I didn't want to somehow have this included.
The human sloth,
That's
right?
excellent.
Right.
With speed.
What happened? 1800 plus.
Paine's reputation kept coming and going. When he died in 1809, he was really a forgotten man. He died with very few people around him, really rather sad ceremony at his burial. And he was really forgotten. In fact, at his funeral, someone made remarks about it, and what a shame it was that this great hero of the Revolution had died and was utterly forgotten by his countrymen. Lo and behold, 10 years later, or thereabouts, the first of a series of Tom Paine birthday celebrations took place, organized by a group of emigre freethinkers in New York City in 1825. And those birthday celebrations occurred continually over the next 10 to 15 years, as all sorts of people, mostly from the ranks of the working men, artisans of various kinds, along with deists and freethinkers, gathered to celebrate his memory. Well, those celebrations faded away in the 1850s, 1840s and 1850s. But then after the Civil War, one finds his memory coming to life yet again, in part through the work of freethinkers. There was a great freethinker at the time, was forgotten today, but then was very well known, a man named Robert Ingersoll, who was a great celebrator of the ideas of Thomas Paine and of deism, but also by others. Walt Whitman, for example, a great poet, was very much a Paine admirer. When he was a boy, he hung around with a man named Colonel Fellows outside of Tammany Hall in New York when he was a young man. And Colonel Fellows had been one of Tom Paine's few friends, a little knot of friends in New York after he came back. And Whitman has a wonderful description of Colonel Fellows telling him about how wonderful Thomas Paine was. And Whitman always considered himself a great admirer of Paine's and wrote this little section in one of his collections of prose about Thomas Paine. Then in the 1880s and 1890s, Paine once again becomes identified with all sorts of labor causes, rebellious causes of one kind or another. Perhaps the greatest Paine admirer, the one we think about the most, was a man named Eugene Debs, who was a great labor leader in the 1890s, the leader of the Pullman strike, and went on to become one of the founders of the Socialist Party. He was a great socialist agitator and leader, the most beloved socialist in American history, insofar as there's been one. It was Eugene Debs, the man who took radical ideas about labor and really put them in an American idiom, really put them in the American grain. And he always said that Thomas Paine was one of his great heroes. So there was Paine again, or at least a person who thought of himself, people who thought of themselves as living out the Paine legacy, very much important, or very much on the political scene in American life.
Oh, sorry, I knew you were going to go on.
That's all right.
Yeah, real unruly.
That's okay.
The other side?
My hair does funny things.
Do you mean this?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I look like a schnook.
That's easy for you to say. You want to talk about the 20th century, or?
Let me stop here
Okay.
and get back to.
Well, you have to remind me.
You said that Paine really affected people. That you're doing a paper, and someone reported that they read Paine, and it was you, wasn't it? Reading Paine changed people's lives.
Oh, yes. When you
Okay.
in the 18th century.
Okay.
We can't have any ghosts
ahead.
running around here. Okay. At the time that Paine was writing, in the midst of the Revolution, and thereafter as well, his impact on ordinary Americans was extraordinary. Today, as an historian, you can't go through a diary, the few that still exist, or a popular newspaper, or any bit of information talking about the common people of the Revolution, and not at some point fail to run across, or one cannot, start all over. At the end of the 18th century, when Paine was writing, his impact on ordinary Americans was extraordinary. He had, when one goes back, he had an impact that was immediate. If you look at the diaries of common American soldiers who were reading a copy of The Crisis, or having The Crisis read to them in camp, in Washington's camp, or if you read any of the popular newspapers that begin to filter out in the 1780s and 1790s, the impact that Thomas Paine had was profound. What was that impact? Well, here was a man, I think, that spoke in a language that they could identify as their own. Not just speaking their mind, but speaking their language. It was a language that drew from a number of different sources, the language of tavern disputes. It's the language of everyday talk, common speech, as well as common sense. That was what Paine gave to them. And he summed up ideas about democracy and the capacity of ordinary people, and in fact, more than just the capacity of ordinary people, but an insistence that ordinary people rouse themselves in these political dramas, that I think really hit home. So it really is incredible to see how much this one person really struck a nerve with ordinary Americans in a way that one simply cannot find of any other writer at the time.
Also, the idea, this is a 20th century word, but if you could, it was hot.
Terry.
Philadelphia in the summer is hot.
Oh, yeah.
So where are we now? What am I telling you about?
We're the power, the idea of the language.
Okay. Okay.
that-
The language of pain isn't simply a language of understanding, it's a language of action. It's a language that tells people and inspires people not simply to think, but to act, to take it upon themselves to do things. So in that respect, it was more than simply an intellectual event, it was a political event. And it was democracy not simply as a series of propositions or as a series of possibilities, but it was in fact a living act, a living thing that people could palpably feel and understand and take part in. Don't forget, especially in the Revolution, during the Revolution, a lot of Paine's readers would have been in the Army. And descriptions that we have of the Army, particularly in the early days, 75, 76, show that even the officers just couldn't bear this drunken, hypocritical rabble that they had suddenly managed to, they were suddenly in command of. There's some great descriptions, particularly early on in 1775, before the formal Declaration of Independence, of what the citizens, for example, who had assembled outside Boston in the siege of Boston, what they were like. They had showed very little respect for their superior officers. They were kind of a bunch of country farmers who had very much their own minds and didn't want to listen to other people tell them what to do. Now, some of those descriptions are obviously biased, or that's not the right word. Some of those descriptions are obviously colored by people's own suppositions of what an army should look like. But what that was really about, at least the way I look at it, was a process of politicization, or people becoming more interested in political ideas and talking about them in a way that is really what marks a revolutionary or a democratic revolutionary moment. This was a democratic revolution not just in the abstract, but in the way, in fact, the people fought the war. In the way, in fact, they went about achieving their independence, not simply through depending on others to do it for them, but as an act in the building of institutions, in the fighting of the battles, in all of these ways. There's an element to this. This is a democratic revolution that the world had never quite seen, even in the 17th century in Britain, in the way that it was achieved as much as in the way that it was thought about.
You talked about something yesterday. I used the word moral toughness, which I didn't quite understand. But, the liberals today, are they pussies?
Well, if we can say that on the film. Liberals today, yes. Liberalism today is thought of as as almost an elitist kind of political ideology. Political. Let me start that over again. Liberalism today is thought of as Liberalism today is thought of very commonly as a kind of an elitist strain of thought. A strain of thought that's based on people who have doing for those who do not have. It's a politics of compassion, if you will. And it's very easily ridiculed because compassion can very often seem like moral weakness or a kind of do-goodism, a kind of weepiness about the world. Bleeding heart is the term that we hear all the time. People who are so well off that they're willing to do to others or do for the very poor and perhaps not do for the rest of the population. Just a tone that is less than tough. Well, what Paine's writings, I think, show was that democracy is born of extraordinary mental and at times even physical toughness, of strength of character, but also, in fact, strength of body very often, the willingness to take risks. Don't forget, in breaking through the deferential society of the 18th century, men like Thomas Paine really did take great chances, great risks. They were doing things that hadn't been done before. They were breaking with what was thought to be the natural order of things. They were standing up and talking at times and in places when they weren't supposed to stand up and talk. And here they were doing it, and not just doing it on their own, but saying that we all could do it, and we all had it within our power to do so. That was a very, very dangerous thing to say. And it brought down the full weight, not simply of the government or of the state or what have you, but it just seemed so odd, so eccentric, so weird. And to do that required great courage. And one finds that in Paine's writings throughout. That tone of almost truculence, of insistence that I have the right to speak my mind and no one can tell me I don't have the right to speak my mind.
People talk about the rage of pain. That's the rage of birth, but it's that he had a fire in him. You know? Like, what was he raging about?
Well, he was raging about a world in which crowned ruffians could run it. The absurdity of a world in which people who had no more brains, no more ability, no more right to rule than anyone else were ruling on the basis of heredity. That was the absolutely galling fact about the world in which Thomas Paine lived, which made him so angry, the way I think of it. And it's that, in fact, we can update that, though. We can find injustices, petty tyrannies, and great tyrannies all throughout the world, in which governments, corporations, institutions are ruled by those not on the basis of merit, but on the basis of either power, inherited power, or money. That if you have the right lineage, or if you have enough money, if you have the right parents, if you have the right background, you are in charge by dint of that alone. Privilege is the simple word for it. Well, Thomas Paine is a living, to my mind, a living, raging argument against privilege. And so he shall ever be.
I would like you to read, but without sounding like you're reading this thing. Just if you could read it, because it's such a good, dense statement, and we'll be able to cut from...
You want me to just read it without... I mean, I can just read it?
Yeah,
but you don't want the voice, you don't want the picture?
We might get it. We occasionally look at me, but if you can...
Okay.
But those are your words.
Okay.
Why didn't you bring the telephone?
Okay. In England, Paine's writing is in the tradition of the free-born dissenting English Democrat. Paine's memory burns the brightest in the English...
Just slow down a bit.
Okay, slow down a bit, fine. In England, Paine's writing is in the tradition of the free-born dissenting English Democrat. Paine's memory burns the brightest in the British Labour movement, and more recently in the British Labour Party. There's a fairly direct line from Paine to the Chartists who held Paine's writings aloft to later generations of trades unionists and socialists and activists who sing to this day of the rights of man. Americans could easily celebrate Paine for the rights of man, but they can never forgive him the age of reason. It was a time when a fervent evangelical movement was gearing up, which would usher in an American 19th century marked by intense piety. From his death to into the century, America's political leaders have had precious little good to say about Tom Paine. It is the slaveholder, Thomas Jefferson, who has become the mainstream's apostle of reason, enlightenment, and equality. It remained for American reformers and radicals of various stripes from the 19th century through to the present day to pay homage to Paine. In England, France, and America, Paine is to this day the hero of democratic causes not yet won, of causes indeed sometimes forgotten.
Say that again, the more conversation.
Okay. In England...
You just tell me that.
Okay. In England, France, and America, Paine is to this day the hero of democratic causes not yet won, of causes indeed sometimes forgotten. Then read, or...
Yeah,
do you want me to emote, or do you want me to make it more conversational?
It sounds
Yeah, just as you were. Good. Okay. Anytime.
Okay.
It's kind of 18th century, wasn't it? Yes.
The real question you're asking, Ron, though, is where does this all connect? His appreciation of science, his politics, his religious views, where do they all connect? And where I think they all connect is in the power of reason and in the power of ordinary people to think for themselves and understand the mysteries of the world. The world that's presented to us is not self-evident. There are things about the world we wonder about. Why is this man in charge, or why is this family in charge? Why do the rivers and the heavens act this way? Why do they move that way rather than another way? All sorts of things lead us to be curious. How do we find out about it? At the end of the 18th century, there was one good way to find out, or one reason, one explanation for how the world worked. It was the revealed Word of God would tell you how the world worked. There were others who said, look to the learned men. They will tell us how the world works. Thomas Paine's great breakthrough was to say, no, every man has it within his capacity to understand those mysteries of the universe, and to call and to think for himself about how the world works, and to act accordingly. And that really is where his appeal to the common man became something more than simply a momentary political appeal. It became a way of thinking about the world and giving people the power to think about the world through natural reason.
And he was, he was a rebel. Who was he?
Well, indeed, and he comes right out of that artisan tinkering culture of experimenters. He was an old son of a corset maker, but the people that were most drawn to him tended to be city types of urban mechanics of one kind or another. The word's a good word, mechanics. People who worked with their hands, who thought about how to build things, how to make things, producers of one kind or another, who actually had to think about things we think of today as scientific, at least at the most rudimentary practical way. Those are the people who were drawn to Paine. There was a culture of this kind of exercise of reason, which connected people's daily lives to their intellectual lives. And Paine was very much a part of that. The self-taught, thinking person, thinking for him or herself, well, in those days, mostly himself. That's the social milieu, the social world, the social place where those ideas had the most power. But it's very much based on the idea that ordinary people have the capacity to pierce through the mysteries of the universe and to understand them.
Give me a center for a lever and I can move the world.
Exactly. Archimedes was the great hero for these people.
Thank you.